Oh, good afternoon. Thank you, Matt. Dwight, thank you to the BMI board. I'm always happy to join you. I think the last time I did this was pre-COVID. We were in Florida. That's always fun too. So thank you for coming to Washington. As everyone assembles, I will just say we could probably wrap up this entire panel in 1 minute. Based on the fact that it's called What's Happening Inside the Beltway. We could just say gridlock bordering on hyper dysfunction. Oh, and by the way, it's an election year, and we could all just, go to the bar. But we are here as a panel of government affairs professionals, so we are going to dig a little deeper for you, and we're going to cut through those top-level atmospherics and provide some key insight on policy topics that I know have been top of mind that impact the book manufacturing industry and the manufacturing industry broadly. Our focus will be on trade, environment, and labor, and that will take a little longer than 1 minute. So again, I'm honored to be here with you all today, moderating this panel, and especially honored to share the stage with these three professionals. They all have very deep policy expertise. They are all attuned to the political dynamics and also have a great handle on how these legislative issues and regulatory issues impact business, and in particular, manufacturing. So before we dive into our discussion, I did want to do kind of a political level set. So the 118th Congress that we're in right now is on track to be the least productive Congress since the Civil War. You may have heard this. I realize there are many of you who subscribe to, if they're not passing bills, they're not hurting us. It's kind of like when they're on recess, we're safe. However, and then there is truth to that. But what happens, though, and what's happened in particular this Congress, is that we've seen the policymaking and the regulatory agendas migrate really to federal agencies, to global organizations, and to state legislatures. So I think even though we're talking about what's happening inside the Beltway, you're going to hear a lot about what's happening outside the Beltway that's kind of driving the dynamics back toward Washington, D.C. So to start, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to share their expertise individually on a few topics, and then I'll ask questions of the panel as a whole, and then we'll reserve time for you all to ask any questions from the audience that hopefully any of us could answer. And again, I didn't even introduce myself, I realized as I started talking, probably because I've had the pleasure of meeting so many of you. But I'm Lisbeth Lyons Black. I am with Printing United Alliance. I am a lobbyist for the organization, focusing on workforce development, policy, labor policy. I also am the director as of last year of a new initiative called Women in Print Alliance, which is a community within Printing United Alliance. And we have some exciting opportunities coming up for women in the industry, not just members of Printing United Alliance, but women who work in print and print adjacent industries. So those of you who are women, please take one of these cards and sign up for our newsletter to be able to get that information before you leave today. And if you're not a woman, you can still take one of these cards, because hopefully you have a rock star female on your management team somewhere, and she can sign up to get our newsletter and more information. So that's me. And we will turn first to Tiffany. And Tiffany Simth is the Vice President of Global Trade Policy with the National Foreign Trade Council. And Tiffany, I'll let you talk a little bit about the National Foreign Trade Council. I know your mission is to advance the interest of U.S. companies in global commerce, and that includes, manufacturing companies, not necessarily print and publishing specific, but cross-section of manufacturing. And I know a lot of your work recently has been through the leadership of the Tariff Reform Coalition, which is a very influential and important group here in Washington, D.C. So I will turn it over to you and ask if you could tell us a little bit about your organization and maybe bring us up to speed on some of the current developments regarding the tariffs that the coalition has been focusing on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, yes, so the National Foreign Trade Council was actually formed in 1914. So we are now 110 years old. President Woodrow Wilson, when he was first starting to contemplate the idea of global integration, he knew that that would only happen if it had the support of business. So he tasked his Secretary of Commerce with organizing a conference of leading industrialists of the day. And one of the outcomes that came out of that initial conference was that they wanted to create this council of leading companies who would advocate for the importance of having global economic integration, the importance to the United States for national and economic security. So we've been about that mission for quite some time. It is lonelier at sometimes than others, but that is that will help frame, I think, my comments in that context. We have a broad set of members: services, manufacturing, innovation and technology companies, more or less within that Fortune 100 sort of scale, and as Lisbeth mentioned, during the Trump administration, we formed what's called the Tariff Reform Coalition. This came out of what were, at the time, a series of late Friday evening announcements from the White House that there were going to be new tariffs on a range of things. And the immediate reaction at that time was, can they do that? And so a number of trade policy colleagues would spend a good bit of time looking back at old statutes that hadn't been used in quite some time. Most of these have numbers. So Section 301 is a regime that enables the president to take measures to combat unfair trade practices. Or Section 232 is a statute that enables the president to take action to protect industries on national security grounds. And so these statutes were used early and often by the Trump administration and put in place a number of tariffs on a very, very broad range of goods from China under the Section 301 statute, and on steel and aluminum worldwide under Section 232, the National Security Authority. Despite President Biden unraveling a very large amount of policies that had been put in place by the Trump administration, on tariffs, they actually left everything in place. And so we are now looking at year 6 of tariffs on these products. And so we have a pretty good window, I think, both of what would be likely in both a Trump or Biden administration, and that is that the use of tariffs as a tool is going to continue to be a popular approach. That doesn't mean that there aren't those of us, and largely through the Tariff Reform Coalition, who don't want to see at least some guardrails put in place on what has turned out to be fairly absolute authority that Congress has given to the president. There is very little ability to go back and check that authority. So one of the conversations that we're having now, it's not ready for public disclosure yet, but there is annually, the Defense Authorization Act is the place where you are able to use as a vehicle, a legislative vehicle, the ability to add new provisions, new conditions, new criteria for a number of defense-related programs. So we are actively working with some in Congress to see if there are things that we could use that process to do that would at least strengthen the Defense Department's role in helping to decide whether a product really is a national security issue under the statute. Because of committee jurisdiction, that's a limited window of what is possible to do. The Finance Committee has the bulk of the authority to regulate the Section 232 tariffs because it's a trade statute. But we are looking for guardrails where we can get them, knowing that there will likely be continued use of this authority over time. I think our members would very much want to try to work with Congress to try to put some barriers in place or some additional guardrails or roadblocks on really unrestrained use of these authorities. And the interesting thing there is, I think it's since now both administrations have used these tools, neither party seems to be particularly interested in tying their own party's hands. So that we have had less progress broadly trying to rewrite these statutes to try to make their use a little bit more difficult or a little bit more narrowing the scope or things like that. But it is a priority for our organization, and we are trying to see if we can find anyone who is willing on that front. A lot of the work we've done recently is on the exclusions process under both Section 301 and Section 232. The 301 exclusion process, this is China again, 301, has really shut down. It's really expired. There is a very small handful of products that largely were either COVID related or very critical products that can only be gotten from China. And so that exclusion process at USTR has largely expired. There are this handful of continuing exclusions. The next expiration date is May 31st. And so we will see at that, sometime in the next couple of weeks, what USTR decides to do about that. We are expecting a report on the operation of the 301 tariffs up in the first 4 years. That may come out as early as this week, but certainly I would expect it before Memorial Day. I think that will include some new tariffs, some higher tariffs, and products that weren't previously covered under tariffs that would be added. I do not expect there to be a new exclusion process as part of that. So the question then really becomes what happens to the few exclusions that exist. On Section 232 at the Commerce Department, Commerce runs those exclusion processes. They have always, that process has been continuing. So it doesn't stop and start. It has always continued. They are looking actively right now to try to streamline that process, both for the staff that has to review and also the people who are applying. So now that they have kind of 5 years of data about what exclusions are getting granted and what are getting denied, then they are proposing to try to do more kind of categorical exclusions. So if there are products that every single exclusion has been granted since the beginning of the process, they would just give a categorical exclusion for the whole tariff line instead of making every company come in and specify what market you want to import from, what quantity you want to import, have to document all of the volume that comes in under that exclusion. The other thing they want to do, though, is the flip side of that. And so if they have been denying most of those exclusions, they want to create a general exclusion. And we did submit comments on that point on behalf of the Tariff Reform Coalition because the markets change really quickly. And as we just saw, whether it is from the Baltimore Bridge collapse or, there are things that happen. And so supply that is available at one point won't be available very suddenly. So what we had asked was that to the extent they're going to look at any kind of broader general exclusion, that there be time limits on that there be some process of reviewing them, or that there is a change circumstance process where if something has dramatically changed, that could be considered, so that the way it would work under what they propose is you wouldn't even be able to communicate with Commerce about a product that is covered under a general exclusion. When you go into the portal to try to submit it and you fill out the form, that product will not be available. So we need there to be some ability to provide some flexibility over time on that front.
I would just add that it's always scary when you get on some kind of list in Washington, because it's usually a list that you don't want to be on, and it's very difficult to get off of the list. So the defensive work of trying to, if you can't stay off the list, at least change the way the list works and make it more dynamic, I think is super helpful. And I know there are OEMs in this room and definitely in the printing industry who have used the exclusions process, particularly during the aluminum tariffs when there was a lot of concern about printing plates and certain components that were being imported actually from Europe, not even from China, but still having to deal with the exclusions. And that was one thing we heard over and over again from OEMs was, isn't there any way we can just do a bulk request? And so I'm glad to hear that there's some efficiencies that they're considering. Do you think that will happen, that they'll create those efficiencies?
I think they will, perhaps with some of the input that was provided about, making them work. I mean, if you look at the number of requests that they're receiving, it's just the volumes are so insane. Yeah. And so they don't want to waste, and companies are spending a lot of money and time to submit those requests. So they don't want to have companies doing that for something that is just going to be dead on arrival. And then they also don't want it, if they know they're going to say yes, then why do they have to put people through that process?
Right. I had a quick follow-up question. You were talking about the Hill and kind of what the appetite is or isn't. I mean, we already said it's slow as molasses up there. We know that. But this now doesn't have a taint of partisanship. It seems like that's also caused it to have a little less urgency. Yeah. But, many people in this room are no strangers to sending an email to their representative or senator, or picking up the phone or saying something at a town hall locally. So is there a message that's helpful for, a grassroots organization like BMI to voice to their members of Congress on, getting engaged on tariffs?
On tariffs? Well, I think that the right message is to continue to explain what tariffs mean for your companies, your business, and in a way that is practical, and encourage Congress. I think what we can say is, once these get in place, nobody wants to take them off. So we need there to be more tools and more guardrails and more opportunity to reassess where you're compelled to reassess rather than it being optional.
Government versus business, right? As businesses, exactly. We would all design it that way. The government doesn't look to design it that way. So that's helpful. Those words, guardrails, tools, keeping things dynamic. Those are all good buzzwords to use if you're talking to your lawmakers about this issue and the process of this issue. Thank you, Tiffany. We'll turn to Louis now and drill down and talk a little bit about trade policies and how they particularly might be relating to book publishing specifically. So Louis, by the way, I should introduce each panelist. Louis Simpson is the Executive Vice President of Global Policy at the Association of American Publishers, another trade association that has had a good working relationship and worked with BMI and the Printing Industry Association and others over the years. So, Louis, I'm wondering if you can start by telling us a little bit about AAP's policy approach to tariffs in general, and then maybe speak to any specific global trade priorities that the association is currently focused on.
Sure. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. As Lisbeth said, I'm Louis Simpson. I'd like to thank Matt for the invitation to once again join BMI at its membership meeting. I think for many of you, of course, know the Association of American Publishers. We represent the three sectors of the publishing industry: trade, education, and the scientific, technical, and medical publishers. In terms of the Section 301 tariffs specifically, as many of you might know, the membership did oppose the imposition of tariffs in 2019. If we step back a little bit on the procedural history, you'll recall that in 2017, the Section 301 investigation was initiated to look specifically at whether China's policies with respect to technology transfer, innovation, and IP were in fact an impediment to U.S. business. And frankly, the foregone conclusion was, of course it would be, because China had policies that either forced technology transfer, was not particularly helpful to companies that wanted to protect their IP in China. The unfortunate thing is, of course, in 2018, when the first batch of tariffs were imposed, these were on a specific set of goods that had that were within the subject matter of that initial inquiry. The unfortunate thing is China, of course, would not sit down passively and accept that. So they retaliated. And what ensued was essentially a tit for tat. So China, we imposed tariffs, China imposed tariffs back. The administration then, frankly, was upset. And as Tiffany said, those late Friday night pronouncements, they weren't official. Some of you will remember some of them came out on Twitter. And they actually surprised even the administration working level folks. Oh, now we're supposed to impose tariffs on everything coming out of China. And that's how the book industry was drawn in. So in 2019, these were the last batch of goods coming from China that were going to be subject to tariffs. And included in that were print books, anything related to the manufacturing of books coming out of China. We, of course, as an industry, submitted comments opposing the imposition of those tariffs. And it wasn't because there was a desire to stay in China. As many of you also know, censorship and content restrictions are very much a problem that publishers do have to contend with in China. So even before the tariffs came along, many of our publishers were actually looking to other markets where censorship is not an issue. Unfortunately, what the government did not understand, or frankly maybe understood and chose to ignore, was that the publishing industry, in much the same way that the printing industry is, we're like a battlecraft. We're an aircraft carrier. You cannot turn that industry on a dime. And so what we were essentially asking for is look at the evidence. Where is the harm really? And does it really impact book publishing? Because the Section 301 tariffs, when they were initiated, they were looking at Made in China 2025. It was essentially China's industrial policy where they were trying to get ahead of everyone else in terms of what they would call, or what we would call, the 21st century industries. So highly technological. And while there are, of course, innovations that have occurred, are occurring in book manufacturing, I wouldn't equate that with, for instance, artificial intelligence at the time. So it didn't make sense to many why suddenly books were being swept in when, frankly, since the 1960s, under a Rome Convention, books have always come in tariff-free, in part because what our goal is to promote information, promote education. So it didn't make sense for many of our publishers that was happening. So it was very much a principled argument as to why examine the evidence, let's make a policy-based or evidence-based decision in terms of policies we adopt. And apologies if I offend anyone, but frankly, the last administration did not look very heavily into the evidence that was supporting the policies that they were initiating. So those tariffs were then imposed in 2019 on everything coming from China with respect to books, with the exception of religious books. And then there was a tariff 4B that included children's books at the end of December 2019, I think because it was the holidays and Christmas season, and many like to give children's books as Christmas presents. They actually held in abeyance the imposition of those tariffs, and they were never eventually imposed. So on that question, I think, Lisbeth, the bottom line is we're not opposed to tariffs in that we, of course, want to bring manufacturing back in terms of books because, frankly, that lessens shipment costs. There is the print on demand that is already here. But the question was, can we do this in time to stave off the tariffs? Which frankly is just a burden on industry. It's not a burden on the Chinese government. And that was never really appropriately and properly explained by the administration. You're not hurting China in any way, even though that's how it was billed. What you're hurting are U.S. industries in terms of these tariffs because we're the ones paying for them, not the Chinese consumer, not Chinese industry. And so when those tariffs were imposed, you will have also heard that the litigation then ensued. The first plaintiff to bring that was HMTX, which was, I think, a floor manufacturing business. So laminate floors, et cetera. And you'll not be surprised to hear some 3,000 additional cases were initiated against that tariff as well, among them a group of book publishers. So with 3,001 cases pending before the Court of International Trade, that's not really a good volume in terms of the case to manage. And so what they did was designate HMTX as the primary plaintiff to litigate the case on behalf of others. Not a consolidation of all the 3,000 plaintiffs, but really just a lead plaintiff to litigate the legal issues that were being brought forward. And essentially the key issues were, did USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, overstep in that maybe the first two tariffs, tariffs 1 and 2, may have been legitimate because there was a finding under the investigation that China was indeed impeding the ability of U.S. businesses to operate in China. But 3 and 4, 4A, which was where books are, they may have been considered ultra vires because, frankly, USTR cannot just go and extend the application of tariffs if the initial investigation did not actually show that the sectors that they were applying to were essentially covered in the earlier investigation. So just a quick summary of that case, all the industries lost at the Court of International Trade. An appeal was brought forward, and that now rests with the appellate court. All the papers have been filed, both government and the lead plaintiff, and we expect oral arguments sometime in the summer. That sounds about right. Yeah. So I'll end there on 301 tariffs. But in terms of the trade policy in general for publishers, we, of course, look to free trade agreements as the vehicle to carry forward a strong copyright and intellectual property framework that the U.S. has, because the U.S. does have one of the strongest IP frameworks in the world, and free trade agreements are the vehicle that level sets everyone else. So we try to bring them up to the level of standards that the U.S. has in terms of copyright protection. And so we make it a part of our policy agenda to ensure that when there are free trade agreements, not only to open markets to U.S. investment and U.S. investors, but also that when those countries seek market access into the U.S., they have to adopt policies that frankly protect U.S. business as well. And so one of our key policy agendas is to ensure that in any trade negotiation, high-level protections for copyright continue to be the norm. And that includes not just policies in terms of the protections that you are granted, but also in terms of the enforcement of your rights in those markets. Unfortunately, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which would have been the last FTA to actually advance market opening policy agenda, the former president did pull the U.S. out of that negotiation, and so we did not have the market opening avenues that would have delivered. The USMCA, which is the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, essentially NAFTA 2.0, didn't really do anything in terms of market opening because we already had access to those markets under NAFTA. What sought to be done was perhaps shore up the protections in copyright that were already existent in that earlier agreement, but frankly, nothing advantageous has continued. And as Tiffany earlier mentioned, and Lisbeth, this administration has unfortunately carried that policy forward. We've not seen advances in terms of freeing up new markets, shoring up our protections overseas. It's become very stagnant in terms of a robust trade policy agenda, even by this current administration.
Interesting. Yeah, and I'm not letting any of you off the stage without a political question. So that's coming, don't worry. But you mentioned, Louis, intellectual property and copyright protection. I know you have a strong policy background in those areas, and AI is, thrown into that mix now when people are talking. And a lot of us don't even really know what we're talking about when we're throwing AI into that mix. So could you take just a couple minutes to tell us maybe what your organization is looking at in terms of AI policy?
Sure. So I think November 2022, all of a sudden, generative AI explodes into the national consciousness. But let's recall that generative AI thing, let's just say the software, the algorithm, that's been something that the technologists have been working on since at least 2010. Why it became so popular and very much the zeitgeist was because all of us suddenly, if we had an account, we could prompt a generative AI tool such as OpenAI's ChatGPT to either answer questions, do a summary for us, or essentially write an email for us. Not a very good one at the time, but they've improved so much. The problem, of course, with generative AI is that they became useful because they were trained on the text materials that publishers create. So authors write the books and write material. Our publishers publish them. And what these companies, OpenAI, Facebook's Meta and Google's Llama, they essentially scraped everything up off the internet, essentially everything that was on a piracy database, so all unauthorized, unpermissioned, uncompensated works by publishers, and used that material to train these generative AI tools. Of course, the publishers got nothing in terms of being compensated for their works, and yet these companies are valued at anywhere from $6 billion to $86 billion, such as OpenAI is. So if you think of the mathematics there, it's simply unfair that these billion-dollar companies who try to masquerade as now startups have used our materials without permission, without compensation, to build their businesses and then make profit off works that they have not paid for. So there is a key copyright question there. When you use someone's material to train your own product, you essentially should pay for that. It's called a royalty. It's called licensing. And I think many of you might have your own business processes that are useful across industry, and you would like to be licensed, for that to be licensed so that you can be compensated for whatever investments you may have poured into that creation or that innovation. That wasn't happening here. It's still not happening, even though there are one or two major licensing deals that have gone into effect, let's say. So the key question then before the courts now is, and I'll say there are 24 active AI cases brought by, of course, creative artists, authors, newspapers, against all the major generative AI developers, including Microsoft, which is one of the biggest investors in at least OpenAI. The argument being that you have used our works without our permission, without compensation, and you are guilty of infringement. As many of you may know, in the copyright world in the US, we have fair use. And fair use is both a very useful, but unfortunately very vague doctrine, where anyone can argue that what they're doing is potentially fair use. It is a defense, it's not a right. And so if you as a rights holder believe that a company has infringed your right, you can sue the company. The defendant may raise fair use. So in these cases, it will turn on the question of transformativeness, whether their use actually transformed either the actual work or the manner in which it was used so that it produced a more useful product. And we, of course, argue that it is not transformative. They haven't done anything truly innovative with the works. All they've done is introduce or ingest that work and are essentially churning out infringing outputs. So just to step back a little, generative AI is the tool in the middle. The inputs, our publishers' works, are ingested by that machine or that algorithm, and then they churn out so-called outputs. And in many cases, these outputs are frankly infringing outputs, because if you use a prompt, so ChatGPT, if you have an account, and you say, can you summarize for me Harry Potter, the Sorcerer's Stone? It will regurgitate essentially identical text from the original work. And what does that tell us? It might be an inference of infringement, because how could it have gotten near identical output if it had no access to the original input? And so that is very much, at least at AAP, it's an all hands on deck matter for the moment, because of course there are bills in Congress that address whether it is in fact infringement, whether there should be transparency requirements. And that just really goes to, if you're a generative AI developer, you should disclose whose works you used, how they were used, or how much of it was used. So that's a critical issue that we're following and hoping that Congress will address. But as Lisbeth said, it's an election year, and it's very unlikely that any of these bills will move. So it may all come down to the litigation. As I mentioned, there are 24 of those cases that we're watching very closely. But I think the bottom line, I suppose, is generative AI will be a useful tool, but it is essential that it be ethically and responsibly deployed as well as developed. And so those are our key points.
Those are, again, good buzzwords. So thank you for explaining that. I'm sure a lot of us have a ton more questions about AI, but that was a really good overview, particularly from the publisher's standpoint. I have not heard that before. So thank you for sharing that with us. We will turn now to Mark Pitts. So everyone has someone they call. Matt said he calls me if he has a question. I turn around and call Mark when I have the question. So I'm delighted to see him here today. Mark is the Executive Director of Government and Industry Relations at American Forest and Paper Company, AF&PA, as they're called, and has a wide variety of issue knowledge, but has a special focus on environmental policy and environmental regulation. So I thought we'd switch gears a little bit and talk about that. And since we've been talking about global commerce, maybe just stay there for a minute, if we could, Mark, and talk about what I keep hearing about, which is the EUDR. So I know it's European Union and it's deforestation, and I don't have a lot of more knowledge than that. So I'm wondering if you could kind of take us through what we need to know about this regulatory initiative, even just as domestic book printers, publishers, manufacturers, and why we should be paying attention to it.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me today. So I wanted to bring up a couple of market-facing issues, some of which will affect you or your customers indirectly or directly as part of the supply chain. So I'll start with extended producer responsibility. I think many of you probably heard about that. It's basically, it's not new. It was a concept where brand owners or producers or material manufacturers pay for the end-of-life costs to recycle or dispose of products they put on the market. That started a number of years ago with very difficult or toxic kinds of products like mercury light switches, fluorescent bulbs, paint, carpet, those kinds of materials. And then as a result of the uproar over plastics pollution, that opened the door for this concept to be extended into our arena, the packaging. So that's how it got started. It's essentially a recycling tax. You can think about it that way. And these programs, they're managed by non-government entities, and they're almost, at least at this point in time, they're all state programs. This is legislation that's been introduced in a number of different states. There's an organization called a Producer Responsibility Organization, or PRO, that is typically elected or appointed to manage the program, collect fees from the producers. The scope of the products that are in these programs typically include, plastic, glass, aluminum, and paper-based packaging, and in some cases also printing paper as well. So it can include all of those. Sometimes printing paper is included, sometimes it's not. And the fees, they vary by producer and the product. And these fees generally are designed to cover material collection, waste disposal, technology upgrades in the infrastructure, educational materials for consumers, program administration, and the development of recycling in markets. And currently we have seen EPR for packaging and print materials having been passed in 4 states, and those being California, Colorado, Maine, and Oregon. It's a long process. So basically, an EPR bill gets introduced. It's essentially a concept that says these bad material manufacturers need to pay for recycling. Everybody agree with that? Fine. They pass it. Then it goes into the regulatory process of it. How does that happen? And that can span months or even a couple of years. So that process is underway in those 4 states. And then we've also seen EPR legislation introduced actively in Hawaii, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Rhode Island. Those are the current states that we see it introduced in, and there will be more. Typically, even though there's printing paper in some of these, almost all of these EPR legislative bills give an off-ramp for book publishers. Bound books are typically out of scope. They don't specify what kind of binding, which nobody wants to get into, but bound books are typically out of scope. The indirect effect, however, for your customers and ultimately you are the potential massive fees that can be associated with EPR. EPR for paper-based packaging and for printing paper is already in place in other areas, including Canada. The British Columbia model is often used as sort of the poster child for the U.S. to emulate in terms of their program. And I can tell you that in 2024, the EPR fee for printing paper is $409 a ton. So those of you who have an idea of what paper costs, and you figure an additional cost of sales of $409 per ton of product, you can just sort of guess what that means. it's going to translate into some very significant trickle-down effects in terms of availability and cost to print paper buyers. And I'll just mention that in 2024, so far this year, the profit margin of the paper industry was 2.2%. So if you think that, this is just, the cost per piece is so small, it's not going to affect anybody, think again. Because we're talking about, cost increases that could be 20% of cost of sales. So,
Mark, I have a question, kind of a process question. You mentioned the 4 states that have already passed EPR legislation and the handful that are in the process now. It sounds like it's inevitable more will join that. And oftentimes from a legislative strategy, when we see these patchwork of state-by-state bills, we as industry associations think, we will be better off with federal legislation, so our companies and our industry isn't having to comply with 50 different sets of regulations and 50 different sets of state laws. In this case, however, would the industry benefit from just one federal EPR, or is it kind of just luck of the draw, hope your state doesn't get into the EPR game?
Well, it's a luck of the draw a little bit because, first of all, none of the EPR bills that have been introduced have any kind of dollars attached to them. So we do not know what the cost would be.
Federally, the federal bills.
Any of them.
Any of them.
Any of them. So if we knew what the cost was ahead of time, then we might be able to get on board. And the fact that it is a patchwork so far, each one is a little different. They'll be run a little different way. It requires a lot more administrative and bureaucratic effort to try to deal with that and manage that. If you do it federally, it applies to all shipments everywhere in the United States. But let's say 10 states do it. Now you've got 10 states. So the overall volume that would be applied to that would be less if there's fewer in a federally mandated process. However, it's a mess.
It's a mess, and it's not just our industry that's focused on EPR. I was at an industry conference at least a year ago with National Association of Manufacturers, and every single person, it was the carpet manufacturers, it was us, it was the consumer brand associations, all the brands, everybody has a bit of concern about EPR. So it's one of these kind of massive regulatory schemes that will affect everybody and will trickle down.
Right. We have a complex supply chain. So this could apply to, like Colorado is one of the worst examples right now, where they are applying it to print paper, any paper, print paper, whether it is right from the mill or from a distributor or used by a printer that goes into the state of Colorado is subject to that fee.
Crazy.
Whether it's printed, unprinted, or not. So, and they're trying to identify brand owners. So if you are a direct mailer and you've got a printer that's in Colorado and sending that out, you're subject to it. So imagine, the bureaucracy involved in trying to manage all that.
My goodness. Is there a good resource for those in the audience to keep tabs on kind of what states are doing what? Is that something that AF&PA provides, or is it something that you know of? I'd just be curious because I'm sure everybody wants to keep an eye on that from their own kind of backyard perspective.
We talk about it a lot in many different forums. I have colleagues that are talking about this in lots of places already, but we do have a biweekly newsletter that we publish. You can get on our website, and that kind of tells you the things we're working on, things that have come up. So that would be a good resource, I would say.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So circling back to, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the EU?
Yes.
Okay, because
if we have a minute to do that.
I think we absolutely do, because whenever I see the EU legislation, I know that it's going to affect us in some way. So I think we all know that. But if you could tell us what we should be kind of forewarned about, that would be helpful.
So legislation has been passed in the EU called the European Union Deforestation Free Regulation, EUDR. That's the acronym. And that is a regulation that is part of the EU Green Deal and the objectives around that. The EU has decided that their 27 member states are going to be carbon neutral by a certain date, and they are now imposing regulations and directions to have that happen and applying that to everything that they do either within the states or anything coming into those states. It went into effect in June of 2023, and it will become enforceable in December of 2024, so not too far in the future. That law aims to eliminate certain forest risk commodities from being placed in or exported from the EU, and that includes coffee, rubber, cocoa, palm oil, cattle, wood-derived products, and printed products, including books or any other printed products. And the law requires that every importer or exporter to prove that the agricultural products, which include those that I just mentioned, are not linked to deforestation or forest degradation. So what does that mean? It requires that every shipment of product going to any of the 27 EU member states must be accompanied by a due diligence statement identifying a product, providing geolocation data for every plot of land associated with that shipment, and providing upstream and downstream supply chain contact information. And depending on the risk level of the country that's doing the exporting, it could mean doing a countrywide risk assessment for deforestation and providing a mitigation plan. So this is something we have never seen before. And as written, some of the obligations, which include this geolocation traceability of what we call residuals. This is forest residual. So when you go in the forest and you cut timber, those pieces that don't go to lumber or building products, the tops and the limbs, we use those to make pulp. When sawmills cut up timber, their residuals, we use that to make pulp. That's 40% of our fiber base. We don't know of any technology that can trace that to an individual plot of land. Impossible. So, and our exposure to the EU is about $3.5 billion. And for printing paper, it's about $146 million. So it's not a small issue. It's a major issue for us and our members. And the implication for book publishers are that books are in scope. So a publisher that exports books into the EU will have to provide that due diligence statement and the accompanying materials identifying that that shipment is not linked to deforestation or what they call forest degradation. We have been engaged in, this is pretty much about 90% what I do these days because of the implications there. We've been engaged with the U.S. Trade Representative, USDA, Commerce, Forest Service, members of Congress, all trying to get some attention on this to try to find a way to lessen the requirements on this. We are used to dealing with international trade and dealing with illegal logging where your due diligence has some association with your level of risk. In this situation, we are required to do exactly the same thing that someone in Malaysia is supposed to do when we have some of the best and most sustainable forest management practices in the world. So, and it could affect a tremendous amount of our trade and effectively stop trade in things like pulp. We are about an 85% producer of fluff pulp that's used to make diapers, incontinence materials that go to the EU. That's at risk.
It's amazing. It's an overwhelming situation to think about. And you mentioned that you've been talking to Congress. I did see just recently that Senators Blackburn of Tennessee and Senator King of Maine signed a bipartisan letter. I think they had 24 senators join them. But that's at least a quarter of the Senate who's starting to pay attention to this. And that's a good thing because usually they're not paying attention until it's way, way too late. So it sounds like you're at least making headway on engaging lawmakers that there will be a problem. So that's something that we can all continue to pay attention to, and just add that to our list of grassroots topics when we have the opportunity to talk with or communicate with lawmakers. I did. So thank you all for that. That was just, I feel like I've learned a ton in the last 40 minutes. Before we open it up to questions, I did just want to ask quickly about labor policy, because all of these issues we're talking about are dealing with global competitiveness, but there's a policy link and thread that runs through all of these issues, and that's the ability to find skilled laborers, particularly in the manufacturing workforce. That's a whole other panel we could talk about, but I'm wondering today if I could just run down the line and ask each of you, kind of from your own either personal perspective or your organization's perspective, what do you think is one policy prescription that we could see come out of the inside of the Beltway, inside of Washington, to help address the issue of not being able to find enough skilled labor? Tiffany?
Sure. So I'll probably have I have a little bit different scope of background on this, but at the very beginning of the Biden administration, USTR actually commissioned from the International Trade Commission a study of how trade had affected workers in certain communities and in certain underrepresented communities and demographics. And one of the findings of that report that Ambassador Catherine Tai, our trade representative, relies on all the time is that trade has been particularly bad for people with only a high school education. And my immediate reaction to that is, well, maybe it's not trade that's the problem. Maybe it's the actual high school education that these people are getting. Because if you look around at some of our very competitive other trade partners in Europe and other countries, people do pretty well in a global economy with a high school education. So I don't have an actual policy prescription of what that ought to be.
It's an interesting perspective.
I think we know where we should start. At one place we should look.
That's great. Thank you. Tiffany, Louis?
I think I'll just build on what Tiffany's point. Specifically, if you look at Germany, they still have apprenticeships, and those do go into fields that don't require a college degree. And I think that's been lost in the U.S. There doesn't seem to be many apprenticeship paths. And you can I don't know much about this, but I do have a friend who's a plumber, and she went into that field because she didn't want to go to college. And frankly, it's worked out really well for her, but that did not require a college degree. I think there's just not a stigma, but it just seems as if everyone wants to go to college because that seems to be what you're supposed to do after high school. But just specific, going back to the book question, when we were first looking at the tariffs, some of our members did note that there were certain skills that the Chinese had built up because we had outsourced a lot of the book manufacturing to China. And so there were, I think, books that required manual labor that maybe was not here anymore. And so could we look to something like apprenticeships that help rebuild the labor force, as opposed to just saying that everything does lead to a college path?
Yeah, that's the Career and Technical Education, CTE. Very important for our industry. Thank you. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So, Mark, any quick thought on the labor issue?
I'm just going to reinforce the apprenticeship idea. I mean, I think that's really important. So much of the paper industry is rooted in rural America, not in the cities. So that's really important. And then we've got, a reputational issue. People think of us as a dirty old analog industry. In fact, we are a very high-tech industry. Takes a lot of technical skills. Lots of technology goes into our industry and management of it.
Well, reputation matters. I know that from the Women in Print Alliance, because not only are we kind of considered, a little bit, anti-technology, but we're also considered a male-dominated industry or male-led industry, and we can definitely diversify our workforce pool, and that's one way to do that, reaching out to, students, to women, to those who haven't traditionally maybe been in the manufacturing workforce in our industry. Thank you all so much. I know there are probably a few questions. Matt has the microphone, so if you could just raise your hand and he will get it to you.
Your way, Rick.
So going to the European regulation, does it address like recycled paper at all? Because obviously we have no idea where all the recycled fibers come from.
If there's a product that's 100% recycled content, that does not apply. But if you've got a product that has a percentage of virgin or fresh material in it, that portion has to be traced.
So regarding the packaging legislation, so let's just say for argument's sake, we assume that the world's largest offender of packaging is Amazon, right? Mm-hmm. Who is responsible for, in those 4 states that you mentioned, for the packaging? Is it Amazon? Is it the companies whose product is in the package? Could you elaborate on that, please?
It's a little bit of an evolving state because, the regulatory prescription has not been totally worked out yet. But essentially, if you've got a box and you've got a brand on that box, then likely you will be tagged with that responsibility. So if you've got that smile on the box, they will be in there. But my guess is they will pass that cost along to their suppliers.
Are you saying the brand then?
Yes, brand owners.
Start seeing a lot more of our Amazon stuff showing up without the box. Now it's a checkbox. You don't have to put it in an Amazon box. It's going to be by default, right?
That's true.
Hey, Mark, back to the EUDR subject of the moment, the day, the week. We're hearing a lot of rumors from some of our contacts in the EU, in the UK, that there is pending legal action against the EUDR due to restraint of trade issues. Can you put any light on that?
Yes. Thanks, Charlie. Good to see you. It's really interesting. We have our sister organization in Europe, CEPI. When this thing first started, we're like, well, you guys are right in the middle of this. Let's work together. And their answer was, this is a regulation. It's done. Mm-hmm. And we're like, no. In the U.S., regardless of what the regulation is, it's not over until it's over. So they were silent. They were basically, they did not want to seem as being the opposite of endorsing EU green kinds of policies. They've now woken up to this once they figured out, holy crap, we got to do all this stuff, but we're not prepared to do this. So the German industry has started that investigation and has hired somebody in the legal area to test if there is a legal case to be brought against that. There's also in the WTO, there is a technical barrier to trade idea that's being floated. We're not banking on that because the WTO could take years before they figure anything out. But does that answer your question?
Any other questions? One in the front.
Yeah, but I need this for the recording, Tim.
This is probably directed towards Mark. I know this is a really complicated issue, but I didn't hear anybody talk about climate change and need to address that, which is driving a lot of these initiatives. So first of all, it's frustrating to have paper lumped in with plastics. That's really frustrating because we haven't talked about the concern for the great garbage patch out in the Pacific, which is as big as Texas. And a U.S.-based company, Coca-Cola, is responsible for 11% of all the plastic floating around in the world. But from the paper standpoint, Paul and I in our company, we kind of track what's going on the recycling side of that. So recycling is going down. So there's more paper and packaging ending up in landfills last year than the year before. If this is coming around, why are we not focusing on doing a better job? We have the tools to do this. We've done this once before, but when we tried to go down that path, and to get publishers and end users to use more high recycle content. They're like, oh, it's a penny more. We're not going to use it. So what's going to change this time?
It's a good question, Tim. And I think that what we're seeing is when you look at how the paper industry is changing, the production process is moving more and more toward brown paper. So it's container board with everybody buying Amazon stuff and paper board. And there's a pretty good closed loop or semi-closed loop in that process where you've got business to business recycling going on. The problem that you are describing is really residential collection, which is the rate of residential collection is abysmally low compared to industrial collection. And that's something that isn't being talked about. We talk about responsibility of recycling. Where does that responsibility land on the consumer?
It's a whole educational component that's one of the most difficult, I think, for the industry to wrap its hands around.
No, we're doing our part. I mean, when we see new board and container board capacity coming online, almost all of it is geared to use recycled product. We are investing in almost $7 billion in new infrastructure that's designed to use recycled product. And the generation of recycled materials that can be used for like book paper or printing paper is going down. Fewer people in offices generates much less sorted office products. So you're just not seeing that. The majority of what's being collected is brown. Brown recycled fiber goes into brown new products, not white new products.
Thank you, Mark. And I think that y'all had such great questions that the panel gets off scot-free now without having to answer any questions about the election. I was going to ask about which sequel you think we'll be seeing. We've seen the movies before, right? We've seen Biden. We're watching that one now. We've seen Trump. We know we're going to have a sequel. We don't know which one it's going to be or what's going to allow the industry to be on offense on most of these issues. And it may be a mixed bag toward trade and some of those other issues. But thank you so much, Matt. Are there any final questions that you'd like from the audience, or would you like us to wrap up?
We can wrap it up with that. So thank you very much to our panelists. It's awesome.
Thank you.